What is the argument that these companies are making as to why they're owed this money?
Right. So the argument that they're making is not a new argument. Back in April, there were a handful of lawsuits filed saying that the president simply doesn't have the authority to rely on a 1977 emergency powers law to order these kinds of tariffs. And lower courts repeatedly agreed with the challengers, said he doesn't have authority to do this. The case made its way to the Supreme Court. And in the weeks after the court heard arguments on November 5th, we've seen this onslaught of activity in court as companies have come in with their own lawsuits saying, we agree, we don't think it's lawful, and if the Supreme Court strikes this down, we want our money back.
Zoe, is this a difficult case? Is it very clear based on the law that's out there?
Well, I mean, we certainly don't know what the Supreme Court is going to do. Key members of the conservative wing had some skeptical questions, tough questions for the government during that hearing, which certainly raised some hopes among the trade bar, among the companies that have been paying these duties, that they might have a chance of succeeding. But it's a novel use of this law, so there's not a whole lot to guide us in predicting what they're going to do. So, everyone is just in a wait and see posture. And talking to trade lawyers, they were saying, our clients have been asking, how do we prepare? And we've been saying, we don't know, but you could file suit in order to try and, line up and be ready if this all comes to pass in your favor.
Costco, Goodyear, Dole Fresh Fruit, J. Crew. Jeanette, come on in here and talk a little bit about the companies, some of the very familiar names and some of the smaller names too that are hopping on this bandwagon.
Yeah, there are some well-known companies, but there's not that many. Most of the companies that have filed are private companies and kind of small and medium-sized businesses, which is interesting. And I think part of what's really interesting about this story, when Zoe first started looking at it and we started talking about it, I think the general impression kind of last year was that corporate America hadn't done a lot to push back against the tariffs. Right? I mean, companies had talked about it on their earnings calls and said it was going to be a cost, but in terms of...
But we're very careful about coming out publicly and saying, this is not good.
Exactly. And some of the large public companies still are very careful. Costco is really the exception, and Zoe's not going to toot her own horn, so I'm going to toot her horn for her, and that of our other colleague, Jaewon Kang. But they broke the news. They were the first ones to report that Costco was filing a lawsuit. I've then spoken to some companies who said they decided to file a lawsuit because they saw that Costco was doing it. So this does have a bit of a snowball effect. How do we get from several companies filing in November to nearly 1,000? It's because they say, oh, Costco is doing this. Actually, that means that maybe this is a good legal strategy. So you had a lot of, as we said in the story, you had a lot of companies jumping on the bandwagon.
But Jeanette, are there risks to doing this? Because you're speaking out against an administration that has shown that it is willing to be punitive when it comes to opposition.
Yeah, I think that is, some of the companies that we spoke with did say that they were worried about that. Yeah. And that's why I think the number that we were the first to report is so important, because there is safety in numbers, right? If you're one of 10 companies filing, right, then you could be singled out. Whereas these companies that we spoke with, I spoke with a really a smaller bicycle company in California. It's like, okay, yeah, we see that all these companies are filing and there is some safety in numbers. So I think that's part of the strategy here.
But it's not like the S&P 500 has come out en masse.
No.
And said, let's go after it. Hey, Zoe, come on back in here. If the Supreme Court declares the tariffs unlawful, then what?
Great question. Everyone wants to know the answer to that question. The first thing we'll be looking for in the opinion is what the justices themselves have to say about what's next, whether they address the question of refunds, who's eligible, whether they kick it back to the lower courts and say, you figure out this mess. There's some precedent for the U.S. Trade Court dealing with a mass refund situation, but even then it involves something like 4,000 claimants. And here we know from court papers, the government has said there are at least 300,000 importers that have paid these contested tariffs as of mid-December. So the scale and scope of a refund process would be massive.
Could they possibly, from a legal basis, say, all right, this wasn't lawful, but we also understand it's messy to clean up. And so from this day forward, you can't do this. Mr. President.
There
Could
was a
that
little
happen? Could that even
there was
legally
a
happen?
little discussion of that during arguments, but not a whole lot of digging into the really practical remedy questions that the rest of the world economy wants to know the answer to. The arguments were very focused on the questions of law, not the questions of reality and what happens next. So it is possible, it's on the table, this idea that they could order only forward-facing relief, but that would leave some 300,000 companies and counting very upset.
Yeah, no, I get that.
I want to let Zoe Tillman go. She's part of the team behind this, but we're going to keep Jeanette Newman here, who covers the consumer and works on this. Well, go ahead.
I just want to ask, in a follow-up to that, would companies be okay with that? What are you hearing in terms of the reporting? Do they just want to win and they want the money back? Or would they be like, okay, kind of not great for what happened, but at least we can move forward and know we don't have to deal with this?
I think it's probably both. And I think depending on the company, but again, as we said, because a lot of the companies are small and medium-sized companies that have filed, and that's the thing. It's like, okay, we haven't seen this massive impact from the tariffs yet, but talking to these companies for this story, what I really learned was that, okay, they've made it through so far, but they really need these refunds if the case is overturned. And if the tariffs are upheld and they don't get the refunds, then this next year and the following year are going to be, that's when we're going to start to see the real financial and economic impact of the tariffs.
I want to go back to what you said about talking to some of the leaders of these companies, especially the smaller ones. You mentioned the bicycle company out of Northern California, Ibis Cycles.
Yeah.
A great bike. The Ibis Haka.
Okay, I was going to say,
the
you're
Ibis
a cyclist,
Mojo.
right?
He is.
I actually had an
Do you
Ibis.
have one?
I bought an Ibis Mojo in 2006.
I had no
2007.
idea, by the way. This was not planned.
It's a great independent bike company.
Yeah.
But you said in the piece that the company paid $800,000 in tariffs by 2025. I just want to remind everybody, the president likes to say it's the other countries that are paying these tariffs. When you speak to these business owners, are they saying that other countries are paying these tariffs, or are they saying that?
No, and they are incredibly frustrated that people continue to believe that. And for example, with Ibis Cycles, part of the issue is so $800,000 in additional costs, and then they have additional duties that they're already paying right before Trump's new tariff. So they're paying a lot in terms of duties and tariffs, and they think that if they raise their prices, that demand would really plummet. So it's not like everyone can just raise prices by a couple dollars to compensate for these increased costs. So that's why this next year I think will be a real turning point in terms of the tariff costs.
Yeah, that's the reality, right? The longer this goes on, there are smaller businesses who are just, you can be pinched for so long before it becomes financially a problem, right? In a big way.
But are these companies, the whole point of these tariffs are to provide an incentive for companies to make their products in the United States. Let's go with some of the companies that you spoke to. Are they able to move their production to the U.S. and stop importing to avoid these tariffs?
Not that quickly. And even, for example, just to go back to Ibis, they have a manufacturing facility in the U.S., but they're still getting hammered. And so if they would want to, for example, I'm making this up, but if they would want to expand their manufacturing capabilities in the U.S., how are they going to do that if they don't have the extra money to invest because they're spending so much in terms of paying for the tariff? So I think they're just really between a rock and a hard place. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would imagine for a lot of these companies, I mean, you're dealing with an administration that I think it's safe to say that you don't want to be on the White House's radar, especially if you're being critical of strategy coming out of the administration. And so for smaller businesses, it just kind of speaks to how much they are feeling squeezed at this point, right? That they feel like, I kind of need to do this.
They are feeling squeezed, but like we were talking about earlier, I think with the safety in numbers issue, now that they're, for example, the guy at Ibis Cycles said, people saw his name in the article and they reached out to him and said, oh, maybe we should actually join the suit. And so so smaller companies, and they also have the benefit of not being as big so as to maybe seem as politically important. So I think there's a benefit there that I think that they can start to reap more now that there's more companies that are filing, right? The safety in numbers.
I have one last question. Was there anything like geographically clumped together? Was there any kind of nuances in terms of the companies that were filing?
The we saw the greatest number of companies in California and New York. Those are obviously population centers.
Makes
there
sense.
could be a political read on that, but we just didn't talk to enough, like a high enough percentage of the companies to be able to draw any conclusions.
Yeah.
There's obviously a lot of manufacturing and importing in both of those states as well, but it was New York and California.